There are moments in every artist's life when admiration turns into disappointment. For Eddie Van Halen, that moment came not once, but 6 times. He had conquered the world with a smile that hid more pain than most people could imagine. A smile that masked years of heartbreak, rejection, and rivalries buried deep beneath the roar of amplifiers. Behind the grin of the man who redefined the electric guitar was someone still haunted by the silence of those he once called his heroes. By the time Eddie reached his early 60s, he had nothing left to prove. Yet, in one rare conversation, he finally spoke honestly about the 6 guitarists who had shaped him through love, rivalry, and bitterness. What he revealed wasn't arrogance. It was confession, the story of a man who gave everything to music and, in return, was often met with envy, coldness, or betrayal. Eric Clapton, the broken heart of a fan. Before eruption, before fame, before the roaring crowds, there was a boy in Pasadena with a cheap guitar and a scratched copy of Cream's Crossroads. Night after night, young Eddie Van Halen dropped the needle on that record and tried to mimic every note Eric Clapton played. To him, Clapton wasn't just a musician, he was a god. In his own words, Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I played that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me. Those hours in his bedroom defined the course of his life. Eddie wasn't chasing fame or recognition. He was chasing a feeling, the emotion hidden between Clapton's bends and silences, the phrasing, the sustain, the restraint. They all became part of his musical DNA. But by the late 1970s, everything had changed. Eddie Van Halen had done something even Clapton hadn't. He had reinvented the electric guitar. When Eruption exploded onto the airwaves in 1978, it sounded like the future, a sound born from rebellion and invention. Yet for Eddie, success came with a price. In 1980, a journalist asked Eric Clapton what he thought of this young guitarist from California. Clapton's answer was short and cutting. "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." Soul. Those words crushed Eddie. He later confessed, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really hurt." The remark revealed more than artistic difference. It was a clash of eras. Clapton's world was built on blues and restraint. Eddie's world was built on distortion, experimentation, and freedom. They stood on opposite ends of rock's timeline, one representing tradition, the other revolution. In the mid-1980s, they finally met in Los Angeles. Eddie walked in nervous, like a fan meeting his idol. Clapton was polite, but distant. They spoke about guitars and amps, not about emotion, not about that wound between them. Afterward, Eddie told a friend, "He's just a man. I think I loved the myth more than the person." That moment changed him forever. It was when Eddie stopped worshiping legends and started seeing them as flawed humans, just like him. Years later, when asked if Clapton's words still hurt, Eddie simply smiled. "Nah. Maybe he didn't get it. Maybe I didn't get him either. We're from different planets." Still, the admiration never disappeared. In 1995, he admitted, "Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable. You can't fake that." And after Eddie's death in 2020, Clapton, who rarely comments on others, privately called him a true innovator. By then, the bitterness had long dissolved into respect. As Eddie told Guitar World in 2001, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." It was a confession that showed how even pain can coexist with gratitude. Eddie's heart might have been broken by his hero's indifference, but that heartbreak forged his identity. It taught him that inspiration can come from both love and rejection, and that sometimes the silence of an idol echoes louder than applause. Richie Blackmore, The man who wouldn't say hello. For Eddie Van Halen, Richie Blackmore wasn't just another guitar hero. He was a prophet of sound. Before fame, Eddie spent nights replaying Highway Star and Burn, trying to capture the magic in Blackmore's riffs. He once called Richie's tone haunting, a mix of anger and grace that made every solo feel alive. So when Van Halen's debut exploded in 1978, Eddie thought he'd finally joined the same league as his idols. But when they met, the dream shattered. In a 1982 interview, Eddie recalled, "He just stared at me. Wouldn't say hi, nothing. I was crushed." For someone as warm and open as Eddie, that silence hurt more than words. Richie's eventual remark didn't help. "He's a fine player, but he plays too many notes." It was half praise, half insult, proof they came from different worlds. Blackmore's guitar work was about precision and control. Eddie's was chaos, instinct, and pure emotion. Over time, though, resentment turned to respect. Eddie later admitted, "Maybe he was shy. Maybe I took it too hard. But man, I worshipped that guy." And in 2008, Blackmore finally returned the kindness, saying, "Eddie brought something new. You can't deny that. He found his own voice by 60. Eddie could laugh about it. We're just people," he said. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to remember." It wasn't hatred, just two geniuses who never learned how to say hello. Joe Perry, the rock star who looked away. In 1978, Van Halen was the new storm sweeping through American rock, young, loud, and unstoppable. At just 23, Eddie Van Halen was still that kid from Pasadena, suddenly sharing stages with the legends he grew up idolizing. Among them was Joe Perry of Aerosmith, a man Eddie deeply admired for his swagger, tone, and raw charisma. But admiration turned cold the moment they met. Eddie remembered those early tours vividly. "People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes, wouldn't say hello, wouldn't be nice, no nothing." That kind of indifference cut deep. Eddie didn't crave fame or validation. He wanted connection, brotherhood, a nod from those who had come before him. Instead, he was met with silence. To him, it wasn't arrogance, it was insecurity. "They wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody because they'd feel threatened," he once explained. The truth was, Eddie represented the next chapter of rock, faster, louder, more inventive, while Perry embodied the gritty blues of the 1970s. They were the past and future colliding on the same stage. Joe Perry's riffs came from instinct and attitude, Eddie's from invention and obsession. Where Perry was smoke and swagger, Eddie was lightning and precision. Years later, time softened everything. In 2013, Joe Perry finally acknowledged what he had once ignored. Eddie's playing was phenomenal. He reinvented guitar playing. I was blown away by then. Eddie no longer needed approval. He had already shaped the very language of rock. When asked about Perry, he only smiled. They made me want to play. I wouldn't be here without them. It was a moment of grace, the kind only a man who had known heartbreak could offer. But his next clash wouldn't be with attitude or ego. It would be with intellect. A battle between instinct and engineering. Instinct, Tom Scholz, the engineer versus the instinct. It was the late 1970s, two rising forces in American rock sharing the same stage, Van Halen and Boston. Eddie Van Halen had just finished his electrifying solo, dripping with adrenaline, when Tom Scholz, the mastermind behind Boston, stepped up next. What happened next left Eddie speechless. Scholz began his own set by playing a solo eerily similar to Eddie's. "I do my solo," Eddie recalled years later, "and then all of a sudden he does my solo. The crowd's looking at me like, what's going on? I was drunk. I got pissed," to Eddie. It wasn't imitation, it was intrusion. His guitar work wasn't just technique, it was identity. Every tap, every squeal, every note was something he'd built from scratch through endless nights of tinkering with homemade guitars and amps. Watching someone echo it, especially a respected peer, felt like theft. Yet Scholz wasn't a thief. He was an engineer, a perfectionist who saw music through the lens of physics and math. With a master's degree from MIT, he had built his own studio and crafted Boston's pristine, polished sound from his basement. Eddie, on the other hand, lived for chaos. Happy accidents, burned-out amps, and the thrill of discovery. "If you think too much, you lose it," he once said. "Music's about feel." That difference defined their tension. Scholz represented control, precision, and calculation. Eddie represented instinct, risk, and emotion. They barely spoke backstage. Eddie found Scholz distant, perhaps arrogant. Scholz found Eddie reckless. In reality, they were both geniuses chasing perfection from opposite directions. Years later, Scholz would admit, "He's got imagination. You can't teach that." And Eddie, too, offered respect. "The guy built half the stuff he used. That's cool. I respect anyone who gets their hands dirty." Rick Derringer, the copy that broke his trust. By 1978, Van Halen was unstoppable. Their debut album had ignited like wildfire, and every night on tour felt like a celebration of something new being born. Eddie Van Halen was in his prime, young, fearless, and completely consumed by music. That's why what happened with Rick Derringer struck such a personal nerve. Derringer wasn't just another opening act. He was someone Eddie admired, a respected guitarist with real roots in rock, known for rock and roll hoochie coo. But admiration quickly turned to betrayal. After one show, Eddie confronted him directly. "Hey, Rick," he said, "I grew up on your ass. How can you do this? I don't care if you use the technique. Don't play my melody." Derringer had just performed a solo nearly identical to Eddie's, note for note, phrasing for phrasing, even borrowing the melody from Van Halen's set. At first, Eddie thought it might have been coincidence, but when Derringer did it again the next night, Eddie snapped. "If you keep doing that," he warned, "you're off the tour." Derringer stayed silent, and by the following week, he was gone. For Eddie, this wasn't about ego or rivalry. It was about integrity. He had spent his life building a sound that didn't exist before him. His two-handed tapping, his brown sound, his relentless experimentation, these were born out of obsession, not imitation. Seeing another musician mimic it so blatantly felt like someone had stolen his fingerprints. Eddie later admitted, half laughing, half remembering the sting. "It's fucked, you know. I copied some of his stuff back then, but this was different. What hurt wasn't that someone borrowed his ideas. It was that they did it without soul, without acknowledgement." Even in anger, Eddie handled it quietly. No public feud, no insults in interviews, just a line in the sand. By the 1990s, the memory had softened into something like forgiveness. "It's funny now," he said, "but man, I was hot back then." Derringer never denied it, but years later, he called Eddie a monster player. Nobody can touch him. Maybe that was his apology. Randy Rhoads, the rival he never made peace with. In the early 1980s, two young guitar prodigies stood at the height of rock's evolution, Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. Both were rewriting the language of the guitar, both adored by fans, and both unwilling to be seen as anything less than revolutionary. The world loved comparing them. The press called Rhoads the next Eddie Van Halen, a title that carried both admiration and poison. For Eddie, those comparisons hit hard. What began as respect turned into quiet resentment. Eddie once said, "He was one guitarist who was honest anyway. He said everything he did. He learned from me. He was good. But I don't really think he did anything I haven't done." His words revealed more than pride. They revealed the fear of being overshadowed. After all, Eddie had fought to build something entirely new, a sound no one had heard before. Now, suddenly, another young virtuoso was speaking that same musical language. Randy Rhoads, however, came from a completely different world. Classically trained, disciplined, and methodical, he approached music like an architect, precise, mathematical, almost regal. Eddie was the opposite, spontaneous, instinctive, raw emotion in motion. One lived in the studio, the other lived on stage. Together they represented the two poles of modern guitar, structure and chaos. And that friction was magnetic. Behind the scenes, the tension was real. Ozzy Osbourne once told Rolling Stone, "I heard that Eddie said he taught Randy all his licks. He never did." Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie either. Maybe they were rivals. It wasn't hate. It was ego, mixed with the uneasy respect of two men who saw too much of themselves in each other. Randy's crew even joked about it. His guitar tech once taped a photo of Eddie Van Halen to the bottom of Randy's wah pedal. So every time he used it, he was stomping on Eddie. It was playful, but symbolic. Both men were aware of the comparisons, and both were driven to prove they were the true innovator. Then, tragedy struck. On March 19, 1982, Randy Rhoads was killed in a plane crash while on tour with Ozzy Osbourne. He was just 25 years old. The rivalry that could have turned into friendship ended abruptly. Frozen in time, unresolved. Eddie never spoke harshly about him again. Over the years, his tone changed. The competitiveness gave way to reflection. "Maybe I didn't hate him," Eddie admitted quietly once. "Maybe I just saw too much of myself in him." Those words said everything. Beneath the bravado, there was vulnerability, the loneliness of a man who changed music and still longed for understanding from those who shared his gift. Eddie outlived all 6 of the rivalries that once haunted him, but not the emotions they carried. They had made him stronger, sharper, and perhaps more human. And by the time Eddie turned 62, he could finally speak of them without bitterness. He understood that what had once hurt him had also shaped him. Every rejection, every cold stare, every imitation, it had all pushed him further toward greatness. In his final years, he summed it up best. "You can copy the notes, but you can't copy the soul." That's what music is. Soul Eddie Van Halen's journey wasn't just about speed or sound. It was about survival. He loved his heroes, clashed with his rivals, and inspired generations who would one day call him their god. But even gods are human. Which of these rivalries do you think changed Eddie the most? Clapton's coldness or Rhoads' unspoken competition? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories of rock's greatest legends.